And while we're at it, if we're going to do Bourbon 101, it didn't go. Take two. Hey everybody, it's Matt, Wrestling with Whiskey, back again, and I thought I'd throw a little primer out there for the people who are new to bourbon, much like I was not so long ago, because it is a very specific type of whiskey. There are a lot of rules, as we Americans like to legislate a lot of things, and so for a lot of you, this is a review. This is something you've seen before. You can watch the next video, I know. But for many of you, you're coming into this, you want to know why everyone keeps giving you weird looks when you call this a bourbon or when it's not, and this a whiskey, and you spell it with the E or without the E and all this stuff. I'm going to give you the basic rules of what makes bourbon, bourbon. You may have heard the phrase, you may not, that all bourbon is whiskey, but not all whiskey is bourbon. But that's simply because bourbon is a specific type of whiskey with rules, like I said, because bourbon was something that was developed in America and is, as of 1964, due to a congressional delegation and legislation, it is a distinct product of the United States. But bourbon, don't get me wrong, is whiskey, so don't let anyone tell you it's not. If we're going to do Bourbon 101, then I guess we have to do Whiskey 101. Because there's a lot of people who have trouble with the difference. And well, if that's bourbon, what's whiskey? And whiskey, on a very, very basic term, basic level, is a alcoholic spirit distilled from a grain mash, a fermented grain mash. That's it. From there, different regions and countries and nationalities, ethnicities, people took their own versions of it and made it very specific. Bourbon, Scotch, Japanese, Taiwanese, South African, Canadian, all these things, Irish. Everybody has made their own kind, but it is all whiskey as long as it is a spirit distilled from a fermented grain mash. Often barley, but can be wheat, rye, corn. People have used oat, people have used millet, all kinds of cereal grains. Whiskey was first, as far back as we can tell, discovered in ancient Greece, used it for medicinal purposes. It was also found via evidence in Italy as far back as the 11th and 12th century, for medicinal and ceremonial purposes. And shortly after that is when it began to gain a ton of popularity in Scotland, developing into scotch as it's known today. They started distilling with malted barley. But whiskey spread all over the world from those early days. And it was in the late 1700s, early 1800s, as far as we could tell, that it came to America and the distilling tradition started using what was available, which was corn. Thus, bourbon was born. Of course, it wasn't called bourbon at first, but it eventually became that. So, via that 1964 delegation, we now have a very legal, very distinct definition of bourbon. And what is that? Well, let's go through the 5 rules that make bourbon, bourbon. Bourbon rule number 1 is that bourbon has to be made in the United States of America. Notice I did not say Kentucky. It does not have to be made in Kentucky, contrary to popular belief, and what people from Kentucky might have you believe. No, bourbon can be made in Alaska, bourbon can be made in Hawaii, Illinois, New York, Texas, Florida, and it is. It's made in almost all of those places. So that is just make sure it's a distinct product of the United States, but any state in the Great 50 can make it. Rule number 2, bourbon has to be made from a mash of at least 51% corn. Because in the days that bourbon was being made and introduced, they often used corn because there was so much of it around in the United States, especially in the regions of Kentucky, Ohio, Pennsylvania, places like that. And so now it's a very big part of what makes bourbon bourbon. Now often the grain level is much higher than that for corn in bourbon. Often it's in 70 to 75%, if not a little bit more. And then you can flavor it technically with whatever you want. Once again, most people use wheat or rye, but you can use a lot more malted barley. You can use malted rye. People, again, have used things like oat, quinoa. There have been all kinds of experimental flavor grains. But as long as it's 51% corn, you're good. Rule number 3, bourbon cannot be distilled any higher than 160 proof. So after it's mashed, it's fermented, it's piped through the still, maybe again, it cannot come off the still more than 160 proof. You have to make sure of that. And in addition to this, an addendum is after it's come off the still at no more than 160 proof, you cannot put it into its barrel at any more than 125 proof. So wherever you distilled it from, you have to water it down to 125 proof at least. Some people proof lower, some people proof at the maximum of 125. That is up to the distiller's discretion. Rule number 4 is that bourbon has to be bottled at least 80 proof. No less than 80 proof. That's a pretty easy one because that's a standard for pretty much any spirit across the world. You see that in gin, vodka, scotch, rum. Nothing is ever really less than 80 proof. Anything less than 80 proof is generally considered a liqueur. So for bourbon, like everything else, gotta bottle at least 80 proof. And finally, rule number 5, bourbon must be aged in a new charred oak container. Something I do want you to notice there. I did say and write container. 99.9999. I'm going to even say 100% of the time you're putting your whiskey in a barrel because that's the only thing that makes sense for both storage, mobility, so on, etc. But that is not what is written in the law. If you go and look up the law, it says charred oak container. You can put it in a box. As long as you char the oak and it's oak and you char it and it's a square box, you can put liquid in it and it becomes whiskey. You can put your old distillate in there, leave it for a few minutes, and you've got bourbon. Now, no one in their right mind does that because it would leak all over the place, and barrels have proven to be the best, easiest, and most effective method to age them. But they have to be aged in a new charred oak container of any kind. And that's it. Bourbon 101, the 5 basic rules of what makes bourbon, bourbon. So now, next time someone tries to argue with you, or you have someone who's asking, what's bourbon, what's whiskey, why is there a difference? You can tell them. Or better yet, you can refer them here and they can learn for themselves and learn all about the crazy world of wrestling with whiskey. And if they do, they can like, comment, subscribe, hit those little alert buttons that lets you know exactly when something new is popping up on Wrestling with Whiskey. But always educate yourself. Always check out new things. Look into the nitty-gritty details. It might sound boring, but it's actually a lot of fun. And that's what makes this hobby so great. And don't forget, always, always, always be wrestling with